their lives for our nation and for our future. To be successful, we need a commitment of every nation represented in this chamber. Acting together, we can replace the horrors of war with the blessings of safety and the beautiful promise of peace. Thank you very much. I now resume my function as President of the Security Council and give the floor to the President of France.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Cher Donald, mes chers collègues, Monsieur le Secrétaire général, Mesdames, Messieurs les ministres, chers amis. Je voudrais tout d'abord remercier la présidence américaine du Conseil de sécurité de nous avoir réunis aujourd'hui pour traiter de l'importante menace à la paix et à la sécurité internationale que constitue en effet la prolifération
which are represented indeed by the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and their means of delivery. I would like to thank the Secretary General for being present with us here today. The first issue on here that comes to my mind when we consider the divisions, frankly, that we have had in the past year on such issues, for example, as a nuclear issue or the chemical weapons used by the Syrian regime, is the following question. What is it that we, member states of the Security Council, can do together? The non-proliferation regime, which organizes the control of new nuclear weapons in order to limit the danger of nuclear war, or which places an absolute ban on certain weapons and does this to ensure that our people never experience the horrors of being gassed or bacteriological attacks. This is a relatively recent construction, and it came into maturity in the 1990s. And it was the result of the tragedies of the 20th century, the firm determination of our predecessors, of their vision of the good of humankind and their spirit of responsibility. And this edifice they constructed is born by mutual concessions, interdependence, and mutual trust that we have built together. In a word, it is based on a multilateral approach to security. Our responsibility, and I believe in it very deeply today, is that we owe this to our people. What we owe to them is to preserve and strengthen this regime at the time when it is being seriously tested. And member states of the Council have to be exemplary in this regard. And in my view, on this issue and many others, we have to stand together. And we were together remarkably so on the issue of North Korea. And last time it was in December 2017 when we passed Resolution 2397. The way of managing this crisis, and this was just recalled by the President of the United States, has gone through a new stage thanks to his initiative to have a direct dialogue with the chairman of the Workers' Party of Korea. And we welcome and support these efforts, as well as the efforts made in this regard by South Korea. At no point should the Security Council lose sight of the fact that North Korea continues representing a nuclear and ballistic threat for the region and for the world. We expect for the Pyongyang regime specific actions showing that they're genuinely determined to dismantle their nuclear and ballistic program, and to do so in a way which is comprehensive, verifiable, and irreversible. As we await such gestures, such actions, our dialogue has to be accompanied by rigorous implementation of the sanctions decided upon by the Council. And on this, we are united. We were also united on the issue of Iran when we passed Resolution 2231, but that was in 2015. Since then, the pathways of the signatories of the JCPOA have diverged. But, and let me repeat it here, we still, all of us here, I'm convinced, retain the same objective in mind, namely preventing Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons and guaranteeing strict international control on the peaceful use of their nuclear program. The JCPOA is imperfect, but it is a decisive step in that exact direction. A serious crisis of confidence was opened by a reimposition of extraterritorial sanctions by the United States, but Tehran continues abiding Germany by its nuclear obligations. Well, this situation has to be countered by the respect of all of the provisions of JCPOA and its resolutions by all members of the UN, and not just by France, Germany, and the UK. We also have to go further than the current framework, and I've already stated the same a year ago, and that is why I agree the goals recalled by the President of the United States, even if we can disagree on the methods as regards JCPOA, but I think that we need to build together a long-term strategy in order to manage this crisis, and it cannot boil down to just sanctions and containment. We need to have the basis for new negotiations and created first by the framework we create for the Iranian nuclear issue beyond 2025 and 2030, and on the issue of the increase of Iran of the scope and the accuracy of their ballistic missiles. So we have to frame their ballistic issue, secondly, and thirdly, the regional stability. It's all of these components that can be part of an international strategy in order to reduce the dangers for the region and also attain the goal that we all want, namely that Iran does not ever obtain a nuclear weapon. We were also united on the issue of eliminating Syrian chemical weapons. This was in Resolution 2118, but that was in 2013. Since then, the threats for the credibility of the ban have accumulated. The reappearance of chemical weapons during the offensives by the Syrian regime at the time when Damascus had adhered to the convention banning that and declared their program did not encounter the needed determination from the Council. Daesh, as far as they're concerned, have used those weapons in Syria and Iraq. And in February 2017, in Malaysia, a member of the North Korea leader's family was assassinated with the use of a neurotoxin, VX. And this year, it was on the United Kingdom territory, and therefore in the European Union, that another neurotoxin was used, and this resulted in a death and an injury for 4 other people. France recalls here that we share the British analysis, according to which there is no other plausible explanation here other than that the responsibility is with Russia, and it's up to Russia to take all the necessary measures in order to make cease this threat. We launched on the 23rd January 2018 an international partnership against the impunity of using chemical weapons, and all of the states are invited to join this initiative. We have to act also, and I would like to thank here President Trump and to Prime Minister May. We had to act there together with the U.S. and the U.K. against this Syrian chemical capacity. We work towards strengthening the Organization on the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons by creating a new mechanism for inquiry and attribution, which is an indispensable tool. Mr. President, France will work ceaselessly for the unity of this Council on the issues of non-proliferation. We have to remain united, because in the recent years, every time when we were not united, it was to the detriment of our principles and our collective effectiveness. It's an issue of our legitimacy as permanent and non-permanent members. We also have to be united because the dissemination of technologies can lead to new threats to peace, and this concerns us directly. The development of intercontinental missiles by North Korea is something that we need to worry about. Up until now, it was only very few states who had these kinds of weapons, and this placed on them very special responsibility. Now, in future, if we do not have sufficient control of that, and if North Korea proliferates, how many other countries will have this weapon? In the Middle East, the ballistic assistance provided to Hezbollah and to Houthis is a new and alarming development. It has to stop before they further destabilize a region which is already tense. Fighting Daesh confirmed that the terrorist groups are interested in the weapons of mass destruction. The threat of nuclear or radiological terrorism has not disappeared, despite the leadership that has been shown by the United States here with the summit conducted on nuclear security. France calls that we continue international cooperation here. It's more necessary now than ever. Mr. President, we will continue strictly abiding by our commitments under the international non-proliferation regime, and will continue strengthening the various institutions which form its backbone. In particular, we will continue to support the efforts made by the United Nations and its experts, and will bring the issue of combating nuclear, chemical, biological, and ballistic proliferation during our presidency of G7 in 2019. And for this, I call for our unity and the spirit of responsibility, because the non-proliferation regime is the backbone of our system of collective security. We kept building it decade after decade. It's still young. It requires our mobilization, our spirit of responsibility, and our unity. I thank you.
I thank the President of France for his statement. Thank you very much. I now call on the President of Poland. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Distinguished Mr. President, distinguished Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, heads of the states, prime ministers, ministers, ladies and gentlemen, the current security situation is not encouraging. Tensions at the global and regional level threaten the existing international order, including non-proliferation and arms control regimes. In fact, we have been witnessing their progressive decomposition. They have been regularly challenged by non-state actors, but what is of even more concern, they are also being undermined by individual states. Before I address the problem of nuclear weapons, I first would like to draw your attention to another type of weapons of mass destruction that made their way back to the top of the global agenda. I'm referring to chemical weapons. Let me be clear. Every use of a chemical weapon is a crime. It does not matter whether it's used on a mass scale by undemocratic regimes against their own people to secure their power, or it's used in a state terrorist manner against individuals abroad on whom a certain state wants to take revenge. And if it is a crime, it means that the principal obligation of the international community is defined by the rule-based order. Criminals must be brought to justice. No single act of use of the chemical weapon can be left unanswered, since it undermines not only the basic sense of justice, but also leads to the erosion of the non-proliferation and disarmament regimes, and in consequence threatens the security of all of us. Brutal attacks, directed mostly against civilians, all have the same aim: to intimidate the international community. The community of the UN cannot accept such methods. Our inaction will only encourage perpetrators. I hope that the finalization of the new EU sanction mechanism, completed in the framework of the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, will allow us to exercise appropriate pressure on current and future perpetrators, as well as deter them from these unacceptable actions. We all hope to have chemical weapons effectively banned by the Chemical Weapons Convention. We must stand firmly behind our own rules and norms, which are the pillars of the international order. In this context, let me mention that, as in the previous years, Poland will introduce in the United Nations General Assembly a draft resolution on the implementation of the Chemical Weapons Convention. It is of great importance to preserve the integrity of this regime. Therefore, we call on all member states to ensure a strong, clear and united message of support of the whole international community for the integrity of the Chemical Weapons Convention and the efforts of the Organization for the Prohibition of the Chemical Weapons. The second issue I would like to highlight is the proliferation of nuclear weapons. Permit me to make 3 points regarding this matter. Firstly, We all know that nuclear weapons cannot be brought on the free market. Therefore, every act of proliferation of these weapons is a failure of both the international community and the rule-based world order. And we must remember that it always involves not only the state that develops nuclear capacity, but also those who provide it with means to achieve it, namely technology, materials, and resources. It's of utmost importance for every agreement that aims at controlling nuclear programs to guarantee that they are used solely for peaceful purposes. We have an obligation to evaluate those agreements against the purposes and to act accordingly. We should not turn our heads back from those who act against the non-proliferation treaty by providing means to develop nuclear weapon capacity or assist in other ways in developing it. Good and effective export controls mechanism should be upheld by all countries involved in nuclear, chemical, and biological trade for peaceful purposes in order to maintain the appropriate control level of dual-use goods and to make non-proliferation effort more effective. In this regard, we welcome the International Atomic Energy Agency's effort to strictly monitor and verify Iran's commitments. Let me also use this opportunity to commend the vital role the agency plays in the non-proliferation area. The agency's system of safeguards is a fundamental component of the nuclear non-proliferation regime and plays an indispensable role in the implementation of the NPT. Secondly, I would like to welcome the prospect of the process of denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. We have seen some encouraging developments, such as the inter-Korean summits and the meeting of Kim Jong-un with the President Donald Trump. This led to the stopping of the missile and nuclear tests. And I would like to stress, Mr. President, that this is in tremendous measure your and President Moon's great achievement and merit. So thank you very much. However, the decisive steps are yet to be made. The lasting peace will not be achieved without the denuclearization of the North Korea in a complete, verifiable and irreversible manner. Until then, the international community must remain united in maintaining real and consistent pressure on the North Korea, including by upholding UN sanctions regime. Thirdly, for the credibility of international community, it's vital to stand firmly behind duties and obligations we took in our shoulders. In that context, let me sadly reflect on the concerning developments of security situation in our region, Central and Eastern Europe. Only in the last few years, we have witnessed the clear breach of the Budapest Memorandum that guaranteed territorial integrity of Ukraine in exchange of its peaceful and voluntary denuclearization. We have also heard about the use of nuclear weapons to end conventional conflicts. Equally alarming was the deployment of a dual-capable means of delivery close to our borders. All these actions have significantly contributed to the deterioration of the security environment. Ladies and gentlemen, what should be our response to the challenges I have just listed? First, the full and firm implementation of the well-established and widely recognized treaties and norms of the international law. Second, support and full confidence for the work of international mechanisms responsible for preventing of the use of weapons of mass destruction. Finally, proactive and constructive engagement in initiatives which aim at fighting with proliferation efforts and promoting transparency and verification. In 2018, my country assumed the chairmanship of the second preparatory committee for the 2020 review conference of the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, and chaired the Hague Code of Conduct against ballistic missile proliferation. Our efforts have been focused on strengthening these regimes, their universalization, securing the widespread and credible verification mechanism, implementation of good practices, as well as tightening the international cooperation. These actions constitute long-term objectives of the Polish security policy. In conclusion, let me stress once again that non-proliferation is a collective effort to uphold the security architecture which we have built for decades, and to prevent the nightmares recurring uses of weapons of mass destruction. We need full commitment of all of us, without any exception, to observe all norms and obligations in this field. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. And I now give the floor to the President of Equatorial Guinea. Please. Thank
you. Gracias.
Thank you, President, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It is for me a pleasure and an honor to address for the first time in person this forum on behalf of and in representation of the Republic of Equatorial Guinea. We thank the United States of America for having convened this open debate this morning, and we congratulate the United States on their excellent work as President of the Council for the month of September. Disarmament is one of the longest-standing goals of the United Nations. Indeed, it was the subject of the very first Security Council resolution on the 25th of January 1946, when the Security Council adopted Resolution 1 of the United Nations Security Council, enshrined in Article 47 of the Charter of the United Nations. 72 years have elapsed since the adoption of the aforementioned resolution by the Security Council, and today the world is once again caught up in an arms race, which has led many states to feel themselves compelled to acquire a range of weapons of all kinds for their defense, and more specifically has led them feeling compelled to obtain weapons of mass destruction in some instances. Nuclear arsenals do not just serve to exacerbate tensions between states and to hinder the drive for peace, but they also put in jeopardy the very continued existence of humankind. Our country, the Republic of Equatorial Guinea, does not possess, nor does it intend ever to acquire, weapons of mass destruction, and we have adopted measures to guarantee the strict and full implementation of the commitments and obligations that we bear to the international community in the sphere of non-proliferation. We have ratified the African Treaty for the establishment of a nuclear weapon-free zone in our continent, a treaty that is better known as the Treaty of Pelindamba. The promotion of nuclear disarmament ought to be a priority, if not indeed the priority, on the agenda of the international community. In 2 years, we will celebrate the 50th anniversary of the entry into force of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, or NPT, which entered into force in 1970, and which is an international instrument that made it possible to halt the spread and proliferation of nuclear weapons to those countries that, as of that date, were non-nuclear weapon states. Sadly, the NPT did not succeed in achieving the elimination by nuclear weapon states of their existing arsenals which they still maintain. There has always been a deep-rooted resistance by nuclear weapons states to complying with the provisions of the NPT, which apply to the implementation of nuclear disarmament. The costs borne by nuclear powers to maintain these arsenals, and in some instances to modernize these arsenals, far outstrip the budget of all nations of the African Union taken together. The amount spent on these nuclear weapons is greater than the budget of all of our nations. President, the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction poses a threat to international peace and security, and it undermines the Security Council in its role of working to prevent the spread and production of such weapons of mass destruction. To counter the proliferation and use of weapons of mass destruction, it is vital to pursue the implementation of and compliance with those international treaties related to non-proliferation, as well as to ensure implementation of and compliance with Security Council Resolution 1540 of 2004. There is also a need to lend support to the Proliferation Security Initiative, to the Global Initiative to Combat Nuclear Terrorism. Action is also needed to ban any test of nuclear weapons, to share information between states and international organizations. There is also an urgent and pressing need to implement systems of joint verification, inspection and oversight for arsenals and research facilities of this type of weapons, and such verification should be undertaken by the United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs in partnership with the International Atomic Energy Agency. And this verification, inspection and oversight work should include securing such weapons and ensuring their destruction. In addition, there is a pressing need to pursue negotiations with nuclear weapon possessor states in order to ensure that they rule out effectively and genuinely the option of using nuclear weapons. Steps must also be taken to ensure that their nuclear arsenals are secured, and the rights of all parties to make peaceful use of nuclear energy must be recognized and upheld. President, the Republic of Equatorial Guinea is alarmed because the United Nations seems to be in a paradoxical situation. There seems to be a disconnect between steps taken here in this House and actions taken by some states claiming their sovereignty, which is undermining what should be an action of partnership and solidarity. Some 2 days ago, we had an extraordinary summit to remember the extraordinary African leader Nelson Mandela, and we all spoke out to reject confrontation and war, to set aside disputes, to live up to his legacy. And in living up to the legacy of Nelson Mandela, we expressed the hope that we might be able to live in a world of peace, security, development and well-being for all. However, it seems that many states have chosen rather to pursue the path of arms and weapons, which runs directly counter to the noble and lofty aspirations of the Mandela Summit, a summit which we all welcomed and all participated in. It is possible to ban weapons of mass destruction and to render their use unthinkable. All that is needed is the necessary will and determination of all parties. The Republic of Equatorial Guinea voices its determination to continue working towards the negotiation and adoption of legally binding instruments that will lead to nuclear disarmament in an effective, irreversible and verifiable way in order to achieve the objective of the complete elimination of all nuclear weapons. The international community of nations should also be worried by the potential humanitarian consequences and the global impact of any accidental or intentional nuclear detonation. And the international community of nations should cooperate on the level of international security to prevent non-state actors from getting their hands on the resources necessary for them to be able to pursue nuclear terrorism. President, the Republic of Equatorial Guinea is persuaded of the usefulness of nuclear energy for peaceful purposes and used under the supervision of the IAEA. I conclude this statement delivered on behalf of the Republic of Equatorial Guinea by sharing with you that in our region, our continent, Africa, there are not, nor have there ever been used, weapons of mass destruction. What has caused enormous loss of life and bloodshed in our continent is the trafficking in weapons, terrorism, and the conflicts that have racked and left a stain on our continent. For this region, I would urgently request you to support the African Union in its noble objective of financing for peacekeeping operations led by the African Union on a case-by-case basis. I appeal directly to the members of the Security Council, asking them to lend their support for a financing mechanism for peace and security operations led under mandates of the Security Council, given that so doing would contribute to international peace and security, which is the principal goal of this august body, the Security Council of the United Nations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I now give the floor to the President of Bolivia. Thank you.
President of the United States of America, my brother Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, fellow presidents, brothers and sisters of the Security Council. The Presidency of the Security Council has convened the members of this body to a discussion on the non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction today. Bolivia hails from a region which has been duly declared nuclear weapon-free for more than half a century now. For this reason, I think I am in a position to recall Article number 1 of the Treaty prohibiting the use of nuclear weapons, which states that each state party commits to never and under no circumstances developing, testing, producing, manufacturing, acquiring in any other way, possessing or stockpiling nuclear weapons or other nuclear devices. I call upon all states around this table to sign up to ratify, and to immediately implement this provision, and indeed possibility of the use of weapons of this nature. This is a moral imperative and a duty that we owe to future generations. Brothers and sisters of the world, the member states of the United Nations are obliged to comply with the core purposes and principles of the Charter of 1945. Above all, we are obliged to abide by the principle of resolving international disputes through the use of peaceful settlement mechanisms. None of these mechanisms presupposes the use of weapons of any kind. Quite the contrary. This is a call for negotiation, diplomacy, dialogue, and legal settlement. And these are the principles that should guide the actions of countries whenever faced with a disagreement or dispute. Bolivia is convinced that only through using these peaceful means will we be able to build fairer societies and societies willing to shoulder their shared responsibilities. We have to be capable of putting behind us and leaving on the pages of history books the primitive use of weapons to attack other peoples. I would like to highlight as an example the contribution made by the International Court of Justice, the primary judicial body of the United Nations system, which has been able to effectively resolve disputes between states in various parts of the world and states faced with different situations and complaints. Brothers and sisters, we are convinced that it is crucial to have a discussion not just on the effects, but above all on the structural and root causes that lead to war, and on the genuine and true motivations of the assaults on international peace, security and justice that we are seeing. Let us take the example of Iran, a country which has been referred to this morning. In 1953, the United States financed, planned and implemented a coup d'etat against a democratically elected government, which, in exercise of its legitimate sovereignty, nationalized its oil production, wresting it from the hands of an Anglo-US company. After that, for many decades, the United States supported an authoritarian government which allowed the profits from oil production to line the pockets of transnational companies. This situation endured until the revolution of 1979. And now that Iran has retaken control of its own resources, it is once again the victim of a U.S. siege. Bolivia categorically condemns the unilateral actions imposed by the government of the United States of America against Iran. Likewise, we condemn the fact that the United States has withdrawn from the JCPOA, hiding behind pretexts to continue its policy of interference and meddling in the internal affairs of this brother country, Iran. Brothers and sisters of the Security Council, we wish to refer to the region of the Middle East, a region rich in natural resources, but thus ripe to be, as it is, affected by invasion, war, and unjustified aggression that continue to cause pain and suffering for the peoples of the Middle East. This region of the world has been the setting for the three most egregious acts of aggression committed during the 21st century. The first act of aggression to which I refer is the illegal invasion of Iraq, based on the lie that that country possessed weapons of mass destruction. This invasion led to more than 1 million deaths. The second act of aggression is the overthrow of the government of Libya, which led to tens of thousands of deaths, whilst pretending that it was for humanitarian reasons. As a consequence, it has triggered serious political instability and unleashed a humanitarian crisis across the north of Africa. The third act of aggression to which I refer is the civil war in Syria, which, over the last 8 years, has cost the lives of more than 500,000 people. This war is the direct result of the interference and of the financing of armed groups and terrorist organizations who have pitted themselves against the Syrian government. Brothers and sisters, over the last few months, the United States has once again demonstrated its contempt for international law, for multilateralism, and for the purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations. Each time that the United States invades nations, launches missiles, or finances regime change, it does so behind a propaganda campaign which incessantly repeats the message that it is acting in the cause of justice, freedom, and democracy, in the cause of human rights or for humanitarian reasons. I would like to say to you frankly and openly here, in no way is the United States interested in upholding democracy. If such were the case, it would not have financed coup d'etat and supported dictators. It would not have threatened with military intervention democratically elected governments, as it has done with Venezuela. The United States could not care less about human rights nor justice. If this were the case, it would have signed the international conventions and treaties for the protection of human rights. It would not have threatened the investigation mechanisms of the International Criminal Court, nor would it promote the use of torture, nor would it have walked away from the Human Rights Council, and nor would it have separated migrant children from their families, nor put them in cages. The United States is not interested in multilateralism. If it were interested in multilateralism, it would not have withdrawn from the Paris Agreement or given the cold shoulder to the Global Compact on migrant. It would not have launched unilateral attacks, nor have taken decisions such as illegally declaring Jerusalem to be the capital of Israel. This contempt for multilateralism is motivated by the thirst of the United States for geopolitical control and for the seizing of natural resources. Brothers and sisters, in light of the aforementioned situations, I would like to hail those countries, France, Germany, the United Kingdom, China and Russia, who have held firm in defense of the nuclear agreement signed with Iran. We praise also those countries who have not abandoned the Paris Agreement, those countries that defend the principles of sovereign equality of states, those countries that uphold the principle of non-interference in domestic affairs, those countries that respect international law and respect those commitments freely entered into and who defend multilateralism. Our congratulations to those countries. The responsibility of our generation is to hand over a fairer and more secure world to the following generation. We will only achieve this dream if we work together to consolidate a multipolar world, a world with common rules that are respected by and defended from all the threats ranged against the United Nations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. President. I now give the floor to His Excellency from Peru.
Buenos días.
Good morning. I would like to greet personally President Donald Trump, and my greetings also go to the dignitaries and high officials present at this morning's meeting. Peru welcomes the convening of this high-level meeting to focus the attention of the world and of the Security Council on the need to halt in its tracks the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and their delivery systems. A particularly apt message, as today marks the International Day for the Total Elimination of Nuclear Weapons. Throughout its history, this Council has stood united in the fight against the proliferation of nuclear, chemical or biological weapons, as well as their delivery systems, and has done so commensurate with this body's chief responsibility of maintaining international peace and security, a task conferred upon us as a body by the Charter of the United Nations. The action of this Council is underpinned by the progressive development of international regimes and systems based in turn on a range of binding instruments adopted by this organization and by its member states. The most recent of these instruments is the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons of 2017, which we hope will one day be ratified by all countries, and in particular by those who currently possess nuclear arsenals. This is no mere flight of fancy. Thanks to the Tlatelolco Treaty, Latin America and the Caribbean is already a nuclear weapon-free zone. And this has been a key building block in our march towards making our region one of peace. Peru, as a staunch supporter of the non-proliferation regime and architecture, fulfills to the letter the obligations established in the respective relevant instruments, and we also comply to the letter with the decisions of the Security Council contained in its relevant resolutions. And as a member of this Security Council, we actively promote strict compliance by all with said provisions and decisions. We believe that guaranteeing international peace and security can only be achieved by eliminating the risk that weapons of mass destruction represent. And the best way of achieving that goal is simply by ensuring that there are no weapons of mass destruction. Thus, we wish to make clear our view that non-proliferation should go hand in hand with disarmament and with strict controls over conventional weapons. From our perspective, this entails first and foremost addressing the challenge posed by the nuclear and ballistic programs of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. On this particular point, we wish to once again hail the high-level diplomacy that your administration and you personally, President Trump, have been engaged in with a view to achieving complete, verifiable and irreversible denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. we believe that the validity of the nuclear non-proliferation regime should be upheld as well through compliance with the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, on the Iranian nuclear program, a plan that was endorsed by this Security Council in Resolution 2231. Additionally, we regret and condemn the use of chemical weapons in the Syrian conflict, as well as in the British city of Salisbury. Against this complex backdrop, and to conclude, President, we wish to underscore the importance of diplomacy, of multilateralism, of international law, of confidence-building measures, and of universality as principles for strengthening the non-proliferation and disarmament regimes. We note that in many instances, it is the perceptions of insecurity that lead to an arms race and even to the development of new weapons and tactics of war. It is therefore necessary, in our view, to address these perceptions, to counter the proliferation and to boost disarmament, investing in cooperation, trade and international development. Because technology should be wielded in the service of peace and progress rather than for inhumanity and destruction. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. I'd like to now give the floor to the Vice President of Cote d'Ivoire.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, heads of delegations, I would like to first of all thank the U.S. Presidency for having convened this high-level discussion on the issue of the non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. I would like to also welcome your presence here, Your Excellency, the presence of heads of states and governments, eminent personalities, which make this meeting all the more significant, and the topic thereof is of great importance for our world. Mr. President, the rapid development of nuclear and ballistic weapons programs resulted in the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. These weapons feed violence and conflicts. They threaten the stability of entire regions and thus make the issue of non-proliferation into an issue of survival for humankind. Indeed, and despite all of the efforts that have been deployed by the international community in order to achieve a nuclear weapons-free world, nonetheless, we still are under common threat from these weapons as well as biological and chemical weapons. As of today, there are 14,500 nuclear weapons in the world. These weapons bring in the risk of nuclear conflict, which would have irreversible humanitarian and environmental consequences. And this is a real challenge for our organization. We also deplore the trend some states show to invest great amounts in modernizing their nuclear weapons, but putting very little into the elimination of such weapons. The Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is considered as a cornerstone of the non-proliferation regime, is today being severely tested, and there is a significant divergence of views during the review conferences which take place every 5 years. The non-compliance by some states with their commitments on disarmament and non-proliferation is a serious risk for security and could lead to the non-state actors acquiring weapons of mass destruction. The issue of the Iranian nuclear issue, the situation in the Middle East, in Syria, with allegations of chemical weapons use, the use of ballistic missiles in Yemen, and the issue of the Korean Peninsula nuclearization, real difficult Gordian knots and real sources of concern for international community. These situations are such that they compel us to place the issue of proliferation of weapons of mass destruction amongst our highest priorities. Given the situation, the Security Council, which is to maintain international peace and security, has to continue shouldering responsibility in the area of non-proliferation. In this context, Cote d'Ivoire calls for the implementation of the relevant resolutions of Security Council and the implementation of the various legal instruments, those which are covering the areas of disarmament and non-proliferation. We invite, therefore, member states to discharge, with the support of the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, discharge their international obligations which stem from the convention, which bans the development, manufacturing, stockpiling, the use of chemical weapons and calls for their destruction. In this context, I'd like to say that Cote d'Ivoire is party to all of the treaties and important conventions in the area of non-proliferation, and we incorporated into our national laws all of the commitments which flow from national legal instruments. In the disarmament area, the step-by-step approach did not result in the desired effect, and we therefore call those states which have nuclear weapons to consider a new, more effective approach. Mr. President, we welcome the adoption on the 7th July 2017 of the treaty banning nuclear weapons. They underscore that it's important to implement it rapidly. Attention and requires an urgent adoption of an international legally binding instrument in order to prevent an arms race in space and make sure it does not become militarized. Further, we underscore the need for the international community to have a more binding instrument in the area of biological and toxin weapons. We also would like to express a wish for a universal and non-discriminatory instrument in order to provide a security guarantee for non-nuclear states. On chemical weapons, we call for a universalization of the Convention of Chemical Weapons and the implementation of resolutions 1540 of 2004 and resolution 2325 of 2016. In this regard, the mandate conferred on OPCW during the special meeting on the 26th and 27th July in The Hague, the mandate to identify and to bring to justice the perpetrators of chemical weapons attacks could greatly contribute towards settling the issues related to the allegations of chemical weapons use. We call on the Security Council to stand united on this issue. Mr. President, as regards the Iran nuclear issue, my delegation supports the implementation of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which is considered to be overall satisfactory. In this regard, we would like to invite the stakeholders to work out their differences over this agreement, which resulted from an extraordinary international compromise and remains to date a certain guarantee for the implementation of the NPT and helps with regional peace and stability. Mr. President, on the situation in the Korean Peninsula, Cote d'Ivoire welcomes the positive developments we have been witnessing recently. The historic meeting on the 12th of June in Singapore between Your Excellency and the North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un, is a major milestone in this new regional dynamic. We reiterate here our attachment to the principles of peacefully settling the disputes through dialogue and talks, and we urge all of the stakeholders to reject definitively any use of military option, which could lead to terrible and irreversible consequences for the planet. To conclude, we'd like to, in Cote d'Ivoire, reaffirm our attachment to multilateralism, international law, and underscore the need to assign high priority to the preservation of the non-proliferation regime, non-proliferation of nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, their vectors, and the promotion of disarmament and arms control. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor to the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you for convening this important debate. There is no greater threat to international peace and security than the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. These issues matter to every man, woman and child around the globe. And the United Kingdom, like the other permanent members of this Council, has a special responsibility to protect the significant gains we have made in the last 70 years. Because the international community has invested huge energy into containing the horrific forces that emerged in the 20th century. The multilateral framework of treaties countering the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction is one of the greatest achievements of the international community, demonstrating the value of global cooperation. It has improved all of our security. It has brought a measure of predictability and stability, and it has paved the way to arms control agreements and disarmament. When many of us around this table were born, it was feared dozens of nuclear weapons states might emerge. Instead, the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons has seen a remarkable near 30 states abandon their pursuit of nuclear weapons. Global stockpiles have been reduced by close to 80% since their Cold War peak. That is true success on a truly global scale. Similar, if not greater success, has been achieved on chemical and biological weapons. Over 96% of declared stockpiles of chemical weapons have now been destroyed under international verification, and no country professes publicly to possess biological weapons. But the last 18 months have seen these hard-won gains challenged. We have seen chemical weapons used in Syria, Malaysia, and the UK. The conventions governing our nuclear compact are being picked at. Predictability and stability are declining. If we do not increase our collective efforts to preserve and build on what we have, there is a very real risk these gains will subside or fall away. The 1970 Non-Proliferation Treaty is rightly perceived as the flagship of the international community's determination against nuclear proliferation. Supporting it requires leadership. Leadership of the short your administration and you personally, Mr. President, are demonstrating on DPRK, the world's most pressing nuclear threat. In meeting Kim Jong-un, you have created an historic opportunity for complete, verifiable and irreversible denuclearization. Consensus from this Council to impose sanctions on DPRK has played no small part. But we will not continue meaningful progress towards peace on the Korean Peninsula without sustained pressure. Sanctions must be strictly enforced by all, including the DPRK's neighbours. We must stay vigilant. Ensuring non-proliferation also requires collective leadership, of the type that led to the agreement in 2015 of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal. For many years, the scale and nature of Iran's nuclear programme raised serious international concerns. The JCPOA was an important step forward in addressing these. It remains the best means of preventing Iran developing a nuclear weapon, and we are committed to preserving the JCPOA as long as Iran continues to abide by its obligations in full. Iran must ensure they implement their obligations fully, and to monitor Iran's compliance, we strongly support the IAEA using inspections and other monitoring provisions of the JCPOA to their full. Other aspects of Iran's policies, in particular its destabilising regional behaviour and sustained efforts to enhance its ballistic missile capability, continue to cause serious concerns. The international community, and where appropriate the Security Council, need to be ready to address this. And Iran's proliferation of missile and sophisticated military technology to groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon, or, as the UN's panel of experts concluded, the Houthis in Yemen, is also not in compliance with Security Council resolutions. It risks a dangerous escalation, so we need to see further decisive action in this Council to tackle both the transit and proliferation of these technologies and increase the costs for those responsible. It is regrettable that Russia continues to prevent the Council from upholding its responsibility to stop this destabilising activity. Mr. President, nowhere are the grim consequences of the erosion of global norms on weapons of mass destruction more apparent than in Syria, where the UN has concluded that Assad's regime has repeatedly used chemical weapons, a direct assault on a near-century-old ban vital to our collective peace and security. Yet Russia has repeatedly wielded its veto to prevent the Security Council from holding the Assad regime to account, even shutting down the international body established to investigate chemical weapons use in Syria. So I welcome the decision of 150 countries in June, the largest gathering in its history, to empower the OPCW to attribute responsibility for chemical weapons attacks in Syria and to put in place arrangements for attribution for any country which requests it. And I would like to thank President Trump and President Macron for their shared determination with the UK to deter the use of chemical weapons in Syria through US, UK and French joint military action in April. These actions sent a clear message to the Assad regime. Perpetrators of chemical weapons use cannot escape identification or act with impunity. The regime's backers must use their influence to ensure chemical weapons are not used again. For there must be no doubt we will respond swiftly and appropriately if they are. The UK saw the consequences of these norms being eroded in Salisbury this year, when Russia recklessly deployed a nerve agent on our streets. The United Kingdom has presented detailed evidence, clearly laid out in charges of attempted murder and the use and possession of a chemical weapon against 2 agents of the Russian state. We have taken appropriate action with our allies, and we will continue to take the necessary steps to ensure our collective security. Russia has only sought to obfuscate through desperate fabrication. Permanent members of the UN Security Council must not attack and undermine the international non-proliferation regimes and the institutions that underpin them. All members of the Council must fulfil their responsibilities to safeguard them in support of international peace and security. It is my sincere hope that Russia will rejoin the international consensus against the use of chemical weapons and the collective effort to uphold it. If so, this Council will again be able to work together to rid the world of chemical weapons. But if not, we should leave no one in any doubt of the international community's determination to uphold international non-proliferation regimes. Not all the challenges faced by the counter-proliferation framework come before this Council, but they are no less urgent. We need to strengthen the rules to keep pace with new technologies and more complex global supply chains. We must help every UN member to develop their capabilities and regulation and ensure they are able to make their contribution to this global effort. The quiet but essential role the United Nations plays must be at the heart of these efforts. So as UN members, we should invest the expertise and diplomatic resources necessary in the conventions. Mr. President, it was collective engagement by states across the globe that produced the counter-proliferation framework. Even the most powerful recognise that investing in collective rules-based restraint was the only effective way of addressing national security interests and avoiding unilateral recourse to force. We cannot let the framework be undermined today by those who reject the values and disregard the rules that have kept us safe. It will take collective engagement to reinforce it in the face of today's challenges, and in this, as has always been the case, the UK will play a leading role. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister. I now give the floor to the Prime Minister of the Netherlands.
Mr. President.
All right, well, there you have it. That's the British Prime Minister, Theresa May, of course, adding in on to the discussion that's currently taking place before the United Nations Security Council that's being chaired by the U.S. President Donald Trump, where they're basically looking at a variety of issues, of course, including the denuclearization of North Korea, for example, Iran's nuclear program, as well as the chemical weapons in Syria. So we've seen a number of leaders, of course, weighing in on the discussion. We've seen the President of France, the President of Poland, the President of Equatorial Guinea, as well as the Vice President of Cote, and we've just had the British Prime Minister, Theresa May. The discussion, of course, continues. The SABC News will keep you informed, but for now, let's take a quick ad break here on the show. There's still so much more to come. Don't go away.
The only way to pour the perfect beer, this professional barman would tell you, is into a glass tilted at exactly 45 degrees. Oh, bless you. Bless you, sir. Bless you again. Well, we'd say the perfect way to pour a beer is at this angle. Straight into your mouth. Tops its bar. Good beer, good advice, no Ponzi beer stuff.
Hello and welcome to The Full View here on SABC News. It's great to have you with us.
You're not answering what I'm asking.
I'm saying to you, none of the commitments were ever met.
No, that's not true.
None of them were ever met.
That is not true. No.
The Monama Trust was not an act of the national government.
Is somebody suggesting that the one who happens to have a white skin should be subject to expropriation without compensation?
But again, I put it to you that has not been conclusively decided. That's what this whole process, which you are a part of, in making your submissions, will decide. We don't know what the final beast will look like. And until we do, all you're doing is fear-mongering.
No.
All right, 24 minutes before the top of the hour here on SA Today. This is the third, of course, and the final hour of the show where we tell your story. Now, the question is, was the Department of Water Affairs lax in dealing with Vaal River polluters? This is just one of the many questions that are being asked by the Human Rights Commission as it continues to probe the issue of raw sewer that's running through this important water source. The South African Human Rights Commission seems no closer to pinpointing who should be responsible. On Wednesday, the Department of Water Affairs presented their version of events. Budget constraints have been cited as one of the factors, while many stakeholders look into the hefty price tag that will no doubt be attached to overhauling the sewer system. Waste continues to flow into the Vaal River, threatening many lives. All right, and we look into what transpired today at the inquiry by the South African Human Rights Commission currently taking place in Van der Bijl Park in the Vaal. And we joined now on the line by the South African Human Rights Commission Head of Advocacy, Philip Molekwa. Good afternoon to you. Thank you so much for coming through here on your story. Just before we talk about the submissions that have been made thus far, let us just get your view as the Commission, more so your impressions really after conducting site inspection at the Vaal River.
Good afternoon to your viewers. Yes, the South African Human Rights Commission conducted my inspection sometime at the beginning of September.